Oh ja.
I'm gonna be here just in case I walk around and stuff.
You don't have to all go at the back. It's much better if you...
Go and do some more photographing because there's an extra 6 people. Sorry?
Do you want me to speak to that?
I'd love to if we can get up there. If we can't, I'll just speak.
You're going to do that?
Yeah.
And I'm doing what?
Then you're doing that's true. Marks in history.
No. Hang on, wait. What that's what I'm doing. And that's more or less what's on there.
But then you're doing the marks in history.
Yes, but this is really... Okay.
Why don't I just do what I'm going to do and then you add anything that I've missed out?
Well, I'm going to say something
About the library?
No, you're going to do this.
Oh, that's me, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that... Okay.
Yeah.
So, we might as well say it.
Yeah, okay.
Well, you better stay here first.
What about, just let me check the door.
Not sure about that.
Okay, we're starting in 2 minutes. We don't need that. There's nowhere to put them, but I know your name now. But I know. Well, there's nowhere to put them. You can't wear it on your head. No.
Yeah. Plugged it in. It's not
While you're what?
I'm kicking off. Yeah?
Well, I thought I was just thought you said something about the long.
Oh, okay, go on then. Folks, what you see is organised chaos. Actually,
it's not quiet.
Everything is carefully scripted.
Yes.
And Mary and I are doing this together just to put you at your ease, so that you know what appears to be total incompetence actually
is not.
We think.
Because,
Sorry,
okay.
Mary.
This is Richard Clark, and you can introduce me.
This is Mary Davis.
Thank you. Right.
Who is
okay,
the trustee of the Marks Memorial Library and the mainstay of everything that
The
happens.
secretary.
And secretary.
Yeah. Okay. That's really irrelevant. But I do want to say something about the library first of all. As you see, we're called Marks Memorial Library and Workers' School, and this is part of the Workers' School because our aim is to ensure that people understand and use Marxism to apply it in the 21st century. So that's a key thing of what we do, and that's the introduction to Marxism. Of course, that is an introduction, and I hope that we'll do more so that it will be a kind of stage 1, stage 2, add it to infinity. Just to say that if you're not a member of the library, there are forms here. Please join, because it is a fantastic library, a fantastic resource, and we do a lot of good things. Can you hear me, by the way? If you can't, come closer, because I can't speak any louder. I want to just say that I really apologise for this setup. It's not... we don't want to do a formal lecture style thing, but we've only got this room and there's quite a lot of people. But just to say that it is a course, this is 4 weeks, and the Richard's going to introduce the course as a whole in a moment. But I do honestly urge everybody who possibly can to come for the whole course. If you want an introduction to Marxism, this one thing won't do it. But it is an introduction. So as a library, as I said, that is that's why we exist, in order to explore the history of the labour movement and a Marxist analysis of society. Last year we we marked the bicentenary of Marx's birth, and we had organised a big conference, an international conference, and this book has arisen from it. Anybody who wants a copy, it's £10, but it's John McDonnell spoke, and he's got an article in here, and there's a lot of stuff on what's going to be the first class today, which is about history and Marx's analysis of history. So obviously don't all rush at once, but you're very welcome to buy this, and you're very, very welcome to join the library. This, Richard will explain, is a bit of an experiment. It's being live streamed to 2 other places, but it might not work. And those of you who've been here before know very well that we haven't got a very good track record in this. But Chris Reeves here is he's giving up his own time to help us through this. We have got slightly better technology than we had last time, so it may work. But if it doesn't, well, we're here. Anyway.
It is working.
Oh, right. Can they see us?
I've just got a comment from Martin Reeves.
What did he say?
I'm in.
Oh, right. Okay.
Great.
Over to you.
Okay, so as Mary says, it's a pilot. Are you going to be on the door, Mary? I think I wanted to get to right. Don't trip over the cables.
No, okay.
And the technology is part of that. It's also the first time that the library's run an Introduction to Marxism course. There are several other courses running, and we've got the programme that you can take away here, including Labour, Value and Profit course, which is being run face-to-face and online, and several others. And in the autumn, there's going to be a very prestigious series of lectures and so on from people who are probably far better qualified than certainly I am to do this work. So it is a pilot. The streaming is also a pilot. There are at least 4 centres elsewhere that are receiving this, and if it works well, we'll continue that into the future. What else is a pilot is this laptop, because it doesn't need to work on the screen and on the laptop screen. So forgive me if there we are. 4 sessions, you know about that. The one that's missing is the environment. There's a lot of stuff now on Marxism and the environment, and I think that will come into each of the sessions as we go along. So we haven't allocated that as a separate meeting. We're going to structure each class in a fairly informal way. Either I or Mary will do an initial presentation, which will just outline the subject area and indicate the key issues in Marxism in relation to these 4 topics. But after that, we'll have questions and working groups, hopefully, where you can form your own ideas about key issues of the present. Because as I'll say in a moment, the course text we're using for this is a somewhat ancient one, deliberately. And what we're going to deny, I think, in the course is that there's any one correct position on any of the areas that we're talking. And so the other pilot is Mary and me working together because we disagree on a whole range of things, and that is as it should be, I hope. And we'll work that out in the course of the series. And finally, there's going to be an output to this. And let's see if this works also. Before we get to, let's get to the output first. The output will include, we hope, a series of features in the Morning Star, which is the only daily paper at the left, as you know. There is a series called Full Marks, which I edit, which appears approximately fortnightly on a whole range of topics. We're into number 53 at the moment, from basic Marxist theory to current issues to do with housework, art, a whole range of sport, a whole range of things. And they are on the web. and you can interrogate those if you wish. But one of our objects, or one of the things we're going to try as part of this pilot, is at the end of every meeting, including this one, we want to give you the draft of the next full marks feature, which we have produced for you to critique, add anything you want to, make any comments on it you want to, and the first 5 minutes or so of the next meeting we'll be looking at that draft, following which Mary and I will revise it, submit it to the Morning Star, and it will be published as the full marks feature. So there is a physical outcome of this course, this class series, as well as our own collective learning process. Okay? Sorry? It will be acknowledged. It will be acknowledged. So there we are. I think that's all, except to say why Burns. Burns' first edition is 1939. The second, and there it is. Hold it up. Okay. The second edition is 1946, and we hummed and hawed about what we would use as a course text. One of the advantages of Burns is that it's online in PDF. It is short, it's structured, it's accessible, and it's representative of at least what, quotes, orthodox Marxist views would have been immediately after the Second World War. On the other hand, you will see when you start reading it, and we hope you will read the prescribed, the suggested chapters before each class, if you possibly have time, it's of its time. So the claim that Marxism forms a scientific view of the world is one of those that you might want to think about. The gendered language, the use of man and mankind, is something which I don't think will be wholly acceptable today. Marx himself, when writing in German, used the words man for man and Mensch for humankind. And Mary and I have taken a collective decision to substitute the appropriate words when we use quotes from Marx, particularly when the original was written in German, where it's quite clear that humankind rather than man is indicated. There's reference not just to Marx, Engels, but to Lenin and of course to Stalin. And you might want to think about, and we shall refer no doubt to, the degree to which those additional contributions are significant in the current age. There is of course a reference to the new socialist society in Russia. There is now very little remaining of that socialist society in Russia. And what the Emil Burns does stress is that Marxism is constantly being developed and applied. So it's quite an interesting text for that reason. It is accessible, but it is also of its time, and maybe as we go through, particularly if you've done the suggested reading, we can look at the ways in which Marxism has developed in the last, 80 years or so, since the first publication in 1939. Okay, so Mary's going to take over and kick off, and I'm going to go back on the door and do some photocopying. Okay.
Right, so then you can't disagree with anything.
Don't trip.
Yes, in terms of the development of Marxism, hence this book, that's exactly what we aim to do. We don't take the view that Marxism is a dogma, that you have to learn it. It's a question of understanding what the method is and whether, if it's relevant, how do we apply it to the conditions of the 21st century. So the first thing that I want to look at, the first class, is basically on Marxism and history. It's not just because I'm a historian that I'm going to say this, but I think that you cannot understand anything without understanding its history, including this building, including... That's me. Oh, okay. Let us begin. I'm really sorry that it is so formal like this, but it can't be helped, but we will break up into groups later. Okay, so Marx's conception of history, economics, politics and philosophy led to a penetrating analysis of historical change. What he was looking at, and I'll explain all this in a moment, was the interaction between modes of production and relations of production and the class struggle which generates such change. Now that's all just words at the moment, but let me just quote this a little bit from Engels said at Marx's grave when he was buried in 1883. Just as Darwin discovered the law of the development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of the development of human history. And this is the key thing. The simple fact, hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing before mankind or humankind can pursue politics, science, art and religion. Well, what does that mean? Anybody, what does it mean to you?
The biological needs must be met first.
So material needs have to be met first, and arising from that
Is the top.
comes ideas. Now we'll have to unpick that, but that is the basis. Some people call it base and superstructure. I don't think that's very helpful, but basically you can't think unless you can eat. You can't exist unless you eat. So your thought and development, brain and everything is dependent on material life. That's a basic materialist proposition as opposed to what could be called an idealist proposition. Some people have thought that ideas come first, that we think about mankind before we actually be. And so when Marx wrote the German ideology, it was to unpick exactly that kind of notion, that it was the idea that dominated rather than the material existence, which was the foundation for all thought. Do you follow me so far? Now, that's the very basic, the base of it all in a sense. So what does that mean in practice? Okay, so base superstructure, not quite, but it's a bit like that. So basically what that then means is that it's the way that you live your material life, your social being, the way you interact with others, that determines your consciousness. Social being is shaped by the way we produce, the way we fulfill our material needs. And that's very critical. I'll see how this can be applied in a moment. When social production, the way that we produce in order to live in cooperation usually with other people, so it might be basic agriculture, it might be manufacture, it might be producing in order to exist. It might be for a wage, it might just be for subsistence, but it's a social relationship. How we produce, how we fulfill our material needs. So but he goes on to say that social being is shaped by social production, and this in turn means that humankind enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will, and that these relations of production, i.e. the way we relate to those things that we need to produce, i.e. We could call it a mode of production, but I'll explain that in a moment. But basically that corresponds to a definite stage of the development of the material forces of production. I know that's it's a bit abstract at the moment, but we'll try and put some. By the way, no PowerPoint for me. I'm sorry about that, but I don't use it. So each mode of production, i.e. the way we produce, generates specific relations of production, and that really is the basis of class society. Again, I'll come back to that in a moment. Class is absolutely central to Marx's analysis. Let me then go back and say why that, what the mode of production is. Modes of production is that there's basically Marx outlined let's say four major forms of modes of production. That is to say, the way in which, the dominant way in any society in which we produce goods in order to live. What would be the mode of production that we live in at the moment? Capitalism. So capitalism hasn't existed forever. The other modes of production that Marx outlined are the huge eras, if you like. He talked about primitive communism, where things were shared in common. I'll come back to that in a moment. He then talked about the evolution of a different form of society from primitive communism once society could produce a surplus, and that led to another dominant mode of production, which was slavery. And of course there is a class analysis there. There's slaves and slave owners. Slavery as a mode of production eventually, and this didn't happen all at once everywhere, because I'll come back to that point in a moment. Slavery then led to feudalism. Feudalism led to capitalism. Now, that sounds too simple to be true, and the fact is that different modes of production often coexist. So, for example, if you think in the same society, think about America, for example, the United States, capitalism, but you still had slavery. So, and there's many societies. Think of Russia before the revolution. Predominantly, well, feudalism existed until 1861, and yet there was still the development of capitalism. So, in other words, it's not a pure thing that you leap from one to the other, but the key thing about those modes of production is that in every case, people have to enter into relations of production. So let's think of the mode of production is there, and I should have PowerPoint really, and the mode of production means that there is a dominant form of means of production, i.e. the way you produce, yes? So, for example, take feudalism. What would be the means of production? How did people produce under feudalism?
Predominantly agriculture.
Predominantly agriculture. And what sort of, who then, what were the relations of production? How did people then utilise agriculture? And what were the classes, therefore, in who owned the land, for one thing? If agriculture was the dominant thing, who owned the land?
The singers.
Yes, or
Landowners.
The landowners, or lords, or whatever you want to call them. And they were called different things in different countries. So they owned the land, but who worked the land? Well, not peasants quite yet. Serfs, yes. So what's a serf then? How would anybody?
Farm worker is owned by a lord.
Sorry, say that again.
A farm worker is owned by a lord.
Yes. In what? So they don't.
So it doesn't have the freedom to move
Exactly.
to work for anybody else.
So they have to pay dues to the lord. In return for farming the land, they might be able to keep a bit of it, but they have to. But they don't get a wage. They're not agricultural labourers. They are serfs. They're not exactly owned by the lord, but they have to give tribute to the lord. Now that mode of production dominated in most countries all over the world really, for a long, long time. There is another mode of production which Marx does call, I'm not going to go into it because it's quite hard, it's called the Asiatic mode of production. It wasn't quite the same as feudalism, but feudalism certainly dominated in Europe. So feudalism in class terms is defined by serfs and lords, or big landowners and serfs. It's not, but it crumbles at the edges, like all of these things do. And the crumbling at the edges eventually leads to capitalism, but I want to illustrate that with a historical example in a moment. So, but just to think about how it is that people come to own things in the first place, because it's not always been the case. I've talked about primitive communism. That was when things were held collectively together. So why did that stop? Why couldn't people just work together and own everything together? And what happened?
Because they started to get more crops from the fields, and they got the surplus.
Exactly. So it was when society was, and this is what I mean about the development of the means of production, once society was able to produce, or a particular community could produce a surplus, the question then was, or is, who would own the surplus? So who did own the surplus? How did that come about? Just move this, sorry. Right, so, yes, so what's the consequence of being able to produce a surplus? And how did people get to own that surplus?
Not everyone has to work.
Sorry?
Not everyone has to work.
Not everyone has
Or
to...
has to labour.
Right. So there's an interesting point about this surplus in relation to women. Can anybody think what it is?
You separate a woman from her family by essentially paying the family of the woman for the woman to join the husband who's accumulated all this grain wealth from farming. So that's you separate women from families.
Not yet. They were still families. Families didn't exist. In fact, there was paired marriage, there was group marriage, there wasn't marriage. But actually, it's when society produced a surplus that all came to an end, and you get the development of what we call the monogamous nuclear family, i.e. one man, one woman and children. But why did that happen, do you think? Sorry? Exactly. But say more.
Because they wanted to sort of protect their own getting the surplus, so they kind of...
So they had to... Exactly. But why was it... But it was men in the main who owned the surplus. Not all men, but some men. But why men, not women?
Physical power.
Yes, and to the extent that women, it's not just biological determinism, but the fact that women had children, it meant that the hunter-gatherers that was where, in the main, not only, but where the surplus could be produced, they were mainly the men, whereas the farmers tended to be women. But the key thing is that surplus, once it was owned and appropriated, then had to be passed on to children of undisputed parentage. So when you have group marriage, it can't work, can it? But if you have a little family unit, then that you know who the children are. By the way, this is why in the Middle Ages women wore chastity, or were forced to wear chastity belts. This thing about inherited wealth is key to understanding why the family exists. In fact, Engels, who wrote The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, said that the development of class society, because we're talking about classes eventually, people who owned the surplus and those who didn't, that's how slavery comes about actually, because I'm kind of compressing thousands of years of history into a few short sentences, but basically you get more and more of a surplus if you take lands from other people. If you take lands from other people, you also can take the people themselves and get them to work for you. So you can see the origins of slavery with a surplus. You conquer the land. I mean, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are full of all this. You know, the Trojan Wars were all to do with, you know, grabbing other bits of territory and then enslaving those whose territory you got. So gradually you got the development of slave society. But the point about the surplus and the development of classes is that what Engels said, that this heralds the world historic defeat of the female sex. In other words, the surplus, which then had to come through inherited wealth, and by the way, we've still got exactly the system today, has to go through a line, and it's for children of undisputed parentage. So that's an aside, but it's not just a casual aside, because if we really want to understand why women are doubly exploited and oppressed, we have to look to the origins of class society to explain it. It's not just because women have got smaller brains or whatever, or they're stupid. It's actually absolutely integrally linked with the development of class society. So, within each mode of production, there is always a conflict between what we might call the forces and the relations of production. That is to say, the people who own and control the means of production, those who work for it, and the actual physical means of actually producing. So within feudalism, well, I'll come on to specific historical examples in a minute. I better just check. So the relationship between the forces of production are the human manual intellectual skills and knowledge, and the technical side of that, the land, the tools, machinery, and the relations of production is basically how human beings relate to that in terms of how they work for it. They can't all own the means of production. So basically, these very broad, big periods, when we call these modes of production, there's always a tension, but the tension doesn't always resolve itself for the majority winning out. And I think there's the only way to understand this, I suppose, is to understand really what the opposite of this kind of analysis is, because all I'm saying is historical change is based on an interaction always within each broad mode of production between the forces and relations of production. And I'm going to give you some historical examples, but first of all, just to say that in essence what I'm looking at is a kind of a materialist understanding of the development of human history. So the example that I want to give is the example that actually is used in Emil Burns of the English Revolution of 1640. Now, how do we explain revolutions? We're going to have a session on the fourth class on the state and revolution, so I'm not going to talk about the state too much, but people don't, well, there was a revolution in this country in the 17th century. It was what some people call a bourgeois revolution. It preceded the French Revolution, which did something fairly similar in 1789. These weren't socialist revolutions. Now, how do we explain, in standard histories, the standard interpretation of the English Revolution is that, well, you've probably all heard it. What would you say? What's the English Revolution all about? 17th century.
The conflict between Protestant mercantilism and Catholic.
Well, you're getting too deep now. But the standard history is it's a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and the great men side of it is that it's a battle between Cromwell and Charles I, yes. So we
it's a battle between absolute power and some form of representative power.
Exactly. That's the standard version, and it's not untrue that those things happened. There was a person called Cromwell, there was Charles I, he did have his head cut off, there was a major change in society, there was a kind of democratisation of society, not fully, but that was the absolute power of the king was reduced. But that just tells you what happened, but it doesn't tell you why.
Wasn't it the rise of the bourgeoisie started?
Well, that's what we've got to come to. So the standard interpretation that it's all a conflict between individuals or a conflict of religion doesn't actually... so if we take the Cromwell and Charles I, and this is the school of history which emphasises always the role of the individual. And you can see that, can't you, on television, where we have these endless dramas, or not dramas, but whatever they call it, you know, Elizabeth, historical stuff. But yes, so it's all about loads of stuff on Victoria, the role of kings, the role of queens, the role of stupid film about Queen Anne, who was completely insignificant. But you know, you can. But, you know, what was the film called? I just thought the worst film. Yeah, it's the worst film I've ever seen. Actually, it's terrible. So the emphasis on the role of the individual, as though that individual really summarises an epoch or historical change of any sort, and it's nonsense, of course. But or that it's purely to do with the role of ideas, Catholicism versus Protestantism. It doesn't actually explain it. Or do you think it does explain anything? Just say no. Of course it doesn't. No, it doesn't though, does it? I mean, I could never understand why these things happen if you just put it in those terms. So sorry. Yes, well, yes, but what is that though? Let's say that really, I would say the Marxist explanation is very of these changes in the 17th century, which actually did lead to a revolution, but not a working class revolution, but I suppose a bourgeois revolution, is that the actors, i.e. people like Cromwell and Charles I, Puritans and the Catholics, they represented class forces, and those class forces reflected the really fundamental changes that were going on within the mode of production. So what do I mean by that? Well, with feudalism by the 17th century, which had completely dominated, was crumbling at the edges. First of all, it was a very inefficient system of agriculture, and some at the edges, some serfs had become the process called commutation. They bought their way out of having to pay dues to the lord, and had also managed to get a plot of land. So there was a beginnings of a peasantry. A peasant, by the way, is defined as somebody who actually does own their own land, but only a titchy little bit. Some of these peasants became a bit bigger, but there was a very, very important aspect of English history, not even Scottish, but English, and that was a system of what's called primogeniture, land ownership. Does anybody know what primogeniture? Go on, tell us.
Eldest son gets it.
Yes, and it's really, really critical. By the way, it's the only way to understand why is the Duke of Westminster practically owns the whole of London. It's very different from in other countries. Why you never had a big peasantry in this country. I said that feudalism was crumbling at the edges, but you didn't get a big peasant takeover. And the reason for that, primogeniture meant that the eldest son inherited always. So big estates, and there was another aspect to that called strict settlement. You couldn't sell off your land. So the land was owned in big, big chunks. So when we talked about, slavery leading to feudalism, I mean, these feudal lords who went to war with each other, that's why you got a monarchy, because they were always fighting over bits of land. Once they got that land, that was theirs. And English law said you could only pass it down to the eldest son. Now, in France it was different, and I'm going to make this point only because it explains why there's a big peasantry in France and not in England. And again, it's a kind of a Marxist materialist understanding that we have to grapple with these things. So in France, what you had was a system of partible inheritance. That meant that the land could be divided between all the sons, never the daughters, by the way, never the daughters. So that meant that if you can think about, say from the 10th century onwards, it was like you had 5 sons and they had 5 sons. By the time you get to the 19th or 18th century, the land is in much smaller bits. That's why you have a big peasantry in France. And that's why one of the things that the French Revolution did was that it gave the peasantry full ownership, because there was some of all peasants for the land that they got. This didn't happen in England. And so the English Revolution, okay, feudalism, I'm saying, was crumbling at the edges, but one of the main reasons why it was crumbling at the edges was that there was beginning to be a bit of a fusion between people who could make their money in a different way, and that was through trade. So alongside feudalism, there was beginning the development of small-scale manufacture, particularly woolen cloth. And you probably know that there was a big movement in the 16th century and earlier for enclosures for sheep farming. This was the way to make money. Wool was essential. And when I say enclosure, that meant that getting chunks of land actually I better not go on to the sheep farming business, that's a distraction. So alternative ways of making money were being found at the edges of feudal society through not exactly manufacture, it was very small scale, no factories, but trading in goods that could be produced as offshoots of the land. And this trading relationship developed a class of people who didn't make their money through agriculture per se, but through trade. And this was the early beginnings of capitalism. There's two stages of capitalism. One is this stage, which I'm going to call mercantile capitalism, trading capitalism, and the next bit was industrial capitalism. And you couldn't have had in this country industrial capitalism without the accumulated wealth of these merchants. And these merchants were piddling to start with, became bigger and bigger, and more important. And with their wealth, as they were acquiring more and more wealth, and by the way, this is a great link with slavery, which I'll explain in a moment, as they were acquiring more and more of this wealth, they didn't have political power. But there was one way of ensuring they did have political power, and that was by making alliances with the landowners, or some of them. Some of these landowners were quite impoverished, but remember, they couldn't sell their land and they could only give it to the older sons. And so these alliances were formed, the marriages of convenience sometimes between rich merchant families. You can see Jane Austen's novels, all of these, they're all about this, how much the estate is worth, how much whoever could bring into it. So that was the way. The only people who had any political power were, of course, landowners. Landed wealth, forever in this country, but basically gave you the right to the vote. Only about probably less than 500,000 people had the vote before 1832. So feudalism is fraying at the edges through dynastic marriages, and then the fresh injection of money from the mercantile class into agriculture, which then meant agriculture became much more productive and could export, and most important, that agriculture eventually could then feed an urban population. We're not there yet, though. So coming back to the English Revolution, basically the forces that represented what was new and developing, i.e. the merchant class linked to some of the agriculture, some of the landowners, not all of them, were represented in a sense by the Roundhead side, the Cromwellian side, who were not socialists, but not by any manner of means. They were absolutely in favour of extending their power, but excluding others. But they were utterly opposed to the old feudal aristocracy, was represented by Charles I and Catholicism. So it wasn't a religious conflict. In the main, Charles I was Catholic, but it doesn't really matter that they were Protestant, because let's leave religion out of it. Let's just say that essentially the Cavalier side, i.e. the Crown side, reflected the feudal aristocracy, and the other side was reflected what was this new developing moneyed mercantile class allied with some of the landed interests, not all of them, but some of them. Now, does that make any sense so far? Honestly, truthfully.
I mean, was there a sort of complete sort of progressive improvement?
Well,
I mean, an Irish person would disagree with me,
well, I'm not saying it was, of course, because Cromwell was not a progressive man. I mean,
Right.
he was. I don't see. This is the point about this revolution. It wasn't a revolution for the people, of the people, by the people. It was for people who were wealthy themselves, who wanted more political power and were hampered by the absolutism of monarchs like Charles I. So they wanted a constitutional monarchy. That's about as much as they wanted. There were forces at work during the English Revolution that did represent not a working class, because there wasn't a working class then yet, but represented the artisan class, and they were politically represented by organisations like the Levellers and the Diggers. And so there were progressive elements amongst the Cromwellian forces in the new model army, and these were the people who were commemorated at Levellers' Day in Burford. Have you heard of the Levellers before?
You're thinking of the Putney debates.
And the Putney debates, exactly. But they weren't. In a way, what they were expressing was a more progressive element within the new model. I mean, it was very, very interesting, the Putney debates, and I think Tony Benn had edited a book on them and thought that they were the most. That they called for a modest proposal for the agreement of the people. They just wanted a bit more. But this wasn't a working class yet. This was a very fractured society. But the interests of capital, in a sense, of this new capital, were reflected in the Cromwellian settlement. But it's interesting to note that period between the English Revolution and then the restoration of the monarchy, 1680, is called, in every English standard history book, is called the interregnum. This was a republic. The period is called the interregnum, the period between the reigns, because it's so natural for this country to have a monarch. We have to refer to the period where it was a republic, and it was, as simply the period between the reigns. Now, I'm not saying that Cromwell was a good man, because what Cromwell did in Ireland, what he did was that's what you were referring to. But it's not a question, it's just a question of understanding what the forces at work were, which actually made a major change in British society. And you can say, well, was it for the better, was it for the good, was it for the bad? That's not the issue. The issue is that it reflected a clash between the forces and relations of production, which produced a different new mode of production, which basically was capitalism. Early stages of capitalism, but the effect of the English Revolution was to abolish feudalism, full stop. And that's the critical thing. So in one fell swoop, that it was a revolution, because it changed not just the government, but it actually changed the way the society produced it. It ended feudalism. So all these histories that talk about, just the role of the individual and so on, are missing one huge point. It was a revolution because it changed the mode of production, in the same way that the Russian Revolution ended capitalism. That's ending, so that clash between the force and relations of production is what drives history, and the English Revolution is a terrific example of how that actually happened. So basically, the standard.
Can I just mention a book from that period?
Sorry?
There's a book called The World Turned Upside
Oh,
Down.
yes, it's very good.
Which actually very nicely describes that attempt.
Yes.
What was almost a socialistic
Yeah.
element. But it also tells how Cromwell actually cut their heads off
Yeah.
after a short while. So if anybody's interested in that particular period, it's called The World Turned Upside Down.
Yes, and also I think this is a fascinating period actually, because it really does illustrate that how a Marxist analysis, only a Marxist analysis, can actually get to grips with understanding of major, and Christopher Hill, by the way, is the prime example of a good Marxist historian of this period, who really tries to say, well, not just why it happened, not just how, not just a selection of facts. There's one more historical example that I just want to give, which shows, I think, how a Marxist understanding can help analyse something which previously seemed inexplicable, and that is, I'm going to use a war as an example. This isn't a revolution. I think what I'm going to look at is World War One, and we've all just come out of this ridiculous period where society, anyway, from last year, the previous 4 years, were commemorating the so-called Great War. And I guarantee that, well, I know that it took me ages to understand why was it that there was a world war in 1914. And the standard interpretation, which I certainly learnt at school, and probably those of you who ever studied it learnt, was that it was all to do with, there's a whole number of factors. The alliance system, that is the force of the Triple Entente and the force of the Triple Alliance, a very shaky alliance system. It was all to do with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It was Britain went to war because of poor little Belgium was invaded by the Germans, or everybody was making lots of armaments, and that was another reason for what this high military expenditure, or it was to do with the Balkan crisis in general. And these are all factors. They don't explain anything. They don't explain why it was that this so-called alliance system was a complete hodgepodge, and actually people change sides all the time, and it was only the Triple Entente powers, particularly Britain, could have easily gone in with the Germans, but they didn't. So what's the alternative? Well, really, the only way that a Marxist could understand the First World War to say that it, quite simply, was a conflict between rival imperialisms. Well, what's the material basis for the understanding of that? It is, I think, that what was happening, the development of capitalism by the end of the 19th century had reached a phase where there was a fusion of two sorts of capital, finance capital and industrial capital. If you take Britain as an example, Britain's chief export from 1870, when the 1870s onwards, was not of manufactured goods, it was of capital. Where was the capital invested? And this is where imperialism is so important, because from the 16th century onwards, and this just links back to the merchant capitalists, Britain was developing a colonial empire, massive colonial empire. By 1914 it was the biggest. The only rivals to that were the French and Germans. So, but by 1914, every single area of the world had been divided amongst the great powers. Russia, in particular, well, let's say all of them: Russia, Austria, Hungary, France, Germany, and Britain. They each had different areas of the world. It was all cut up by the Berlin Colonial Conference in the 1880s, 1885, had divided the world quite clearly up amongst. There was nothing left to be divided. Every single area of the world, with one exception actually, only one country had escaped. That was Ethiopia, but Mussolini ended all that because he invaded. But that was later. So Africa, Asia, everywhere. Well, what could be the only way that the interests of capital could be satisfied was by redividing the world. And that redivision really was basically what caused the First World War. there were loads of little small conflicts going on in almost every country between Germany and Britain in the south of Africa, between France and Britain in North Africa, between well, I could go on, but I won't. So you could say, well, it was bound to lead to an international conflict, which it was, but it can only be understood by seeing that what the forces were at work there was the imperative necessity for finance and industrial capital, monopoly capitalism, to then redivide and retake to redraw the boundaries. And the proof of that, I think, can be seen actually during the war, in 1916, the Sykes-Picot Treaty, in which France and Britain drew a map up which divided German territories between them. And you can, that's in fact, this treaty, the secret treaty, was revealed in 1917 after the Russian Revolution. Trotsky let it all out, all these secret treaties. Oh, by the way, Russia had been involved in the secret treaty as well. So this redivision, that was really the explanation of the First World War. And Lenin's imperialism, which was an application of Marxism in the 20th century, was absolutely essential to understanding that. So basically, I've got to shut up in a minute.
Sorry, to get back to your question, wasn't it? I mean, I've kind of thought that it was because kind of Germany, Austria-Hungary, they didn't have empire, they didn't have access
To the sea, yeah.
I don't know where Ottoman Empire
yeah,
comes into.
yeah. But what happened afterwards is all of these empires were broken up. But anyway, I'm just using that as an example to say you have to get deeper into understanding what were the underlying forces rather than the phenomenal form, of just a battle between alliances. But just I've got to shut up in a minute. But just to say very, very quickly, where do ideas fit in? Why do we still have things like the monarchy and religion? If what I've said is true, and that is, it's the social being, the material forces which then kind of determine what people think. It shouldn't be determinism. If it is determinism, how do we explain that certain ideas seem to kind of permeate through all forms of class society? A monarchy was the product of feudal rivalries. So why does it still exist under capitalism? Why do we still have religion? Why does the working class consent to be ruled? We are now the majority of the population, and yet we still allow ourselves to be exploited. So all ideas have got a material base, including socialist ideas, but the ruling ideas represent the ideas of the ruling class. We're going to discuss that a bit more in the following classes, but really, if we say that class and class struggle is the motor of history, which is essentially what's happened, although the class struggle doesn't necessarily lead to a socialist revolution, it should under capitalism, obviously. But if class is the motor of history, then we have to explain why we seem to consent. And I'll just end up by saying that it's really class consciousness that is the key element in trying to understand this. And when we look at the fourth class on the revolutionary, on the state and revolution, this is the issue that we'll have to look at. But the role of ideas is paramount, and it's not enough to talk about base and superstructure. We've got the material base, and the ideological superstructure rests on it. There is a relationship, but it's not necessarily a deterministic relationship. So that the ideas that we unfortunately all have in society are the dominant ideas, are those of the dominant class. And the question of how that changes is something that we're going to come back to. But just the very final word is to say that a Marxist analysis of history, I think, is an analysis of how change takes place. And that's the key thing. Because nothing nothing is static. Everything is changing all the time. All the time. Famous little phrase of Marx, all that's solid melts into air, and it's true. There is nothing, everything is in motion, in movement, but understanding how that moves and how that changes is the key essence of what is called historical materialism. Understanding the force and relations of production clashing within each mode of production, not necessarily producing the outcome we want, although the outcome under capitalism has to be something that we want, but only if we consciously understand it and fight for it. I'm going to stop there, because what you're going to do now, hopefully, is to have a discussion. There's a lot of people here, actually. Do we know how Richard, have you counted? 27. Oh God, I haven't even got enough paper. Are you all coming back next week? I'll make sure you do. Okay, look, you need to break into, I'd say, 5 groups of 5 people. So you could shift your chairs around. Can you just from, unless I give you all a number and all the ones go. I didn't think there was going to be so many here. Just go wherever you can. This is not ideal, honestly.
I'm turning a chair around.
Fantastic, thank you.
I have 2 more here.
We've got a big group of friends.
This class struggle with integration. So there's a conflict of interest between classes. Where there's, I suppose, oppression, there's always resistance. So there's always going to be struggle.
Do you want to start with questions? Okay. Group 1 here would like to start. With question 1. We've exhausted it now to 2, 3, 4, 5. This group, question 2. 7, 3, 4, 5, 3. Yeah. 4. 5.
And this is okay, by the way, this is open eye. Is that what you do? Okay, so you've got 21 Hello everybody,